I suggest to parents a very different way of praising kids, which is not just for kids. What people want is they want descriptions that show appreciation. So, for example, wow, there was so much thought put into this. I notice that you got that data from the marketing department, and you took the perspective of the sales team, and you figured out a way to I'm completely making this up, but the more we can describe what we see or describe the effect this is going to have on our ultimate goals, the more you're going to feel like you really do appreciate what I did. You noticed all the details.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Berman, and this is The Irrational Mind. This podcast is for product, marketing, and design folks, people who want to understand how their customers really think and get inspired to build products that don't just sell, but also change behavior. To help us explore that today, I'm speaking with Julie King, a parenting expert and co-author of How to Talk So Little Kids Will Listen. And she has spent her career helping parents navigate the messy and emotional world of raising children. As both a mother of two and a behavioral scientist, I can tell you there's nothing more rooted in behavioral science than raising a little human. Parents tackle one of life's toughest behavior change challenges, getting strong-willed little ones to cooperate, learn, and thrive, all while building a positive relationship. And surprisingly, the principles that help parents guide their kids work just as well for designing better products, improving workplace dynamics, and changing our own habits. Let me share a story that captures this perfectly. I once observed a preschool teacher managing a classroom of energetic kids. When one 4-year-old wouldn't stop running and throwing themselves on the floor, she started with the usual, "Stop running." But then something fascinating happened. She caught herself and instead asked, "Can you show me a slow motion dive?" The child stopped immediately and then gracefully moved into a slow motion, pretending to dive into this imaginary pool. The teacher applauded and asked to see it again. What this teacher and Julie both understand is that core psychological principles can work on everyone, regardless of age. Instead of saying what not to do, she showed the child what to do and made it fun. At Irrational Labs, we often discuss with our clients how users have present bias throughout a sign-up flow or product funnel. If they don't get immediate value, they'll leave. But we find that if you make something more enjoyable, more interesting, it can provide that instant reward that drives stickiness. However, sometimes teams do need to reimagine their features, just like that preschool teacher did, to create appeal in the moment. So in this episode, we'll explore practical parenting strategies for things like bedtime, meals, and meltdowns. But try to listen with your users and employees in mind. These tactics work just as well with them, and not because adults are like small children, but because traditional persuasion methods often ignore how the human mind actually works. This is crystal clear when we're trying to persuade a 2-year-old to go to bed or stop running, but it's not as clear when we're trying to persuade our employee, customer, or spouse to do something. This episode inspired me to think differently about behavior change, and I hope it has the same effect on you. This podcast is brought to you by my company, Irrational Labs. Irrational Labs is a SWAT team of behavioral scientists. We help companies design and build products that customers use, love, and pay for. My conversation with Julie and all the other episodes in this season are an exploration of behavior change across different domains. If you like it, you may also like working with us. Give me a shout at hello@irrationallabs.com and mention the podcast, or go to irrationallabs.com and read our case studies with Lyft, One Medical, TikTok, Credit Karma, and others to see some fun results. Welcome, Julie. Very excited to have you on the show.
Thank you.
We are going to dive into books around how to talk so little kids will listen, and kind of the gamut of other things that you think through about how to work with and parent children. Our main goal will, though, be to figure out how we can apply that to adults.
Okay,
Sound good?
I'm ready.
Right, let's do it. Okay, so I think we're going to dive in and just give people a sense of how you solve problems with little kids. And maybe we don't even call them problems, but how we solve behavior opportunities with little
Okay.
little children. And I have to admit, as background, I do have an almost 2-year-old, so we will probably talk a little bit about her as well.
I love real examples, so that's great.
Great. So let's start with basically, I think there's a few moments in a parent's life that are harder than others. And I would say eating and bath time are ones that people talk about a lot. So imagine that a child is kind of refusing to eat something. They say, I don't want to eat this. How would you handle that situation?
Okay, well, if I'm consulting with the parent, you're asking me, right?
Correct.
Okay. The first question I always ask myself, and then I'll often ask the parent is why? Why is this child not eating? Now, I've talked to many parents about this issue in particular, and so I'm quite aware that there are many reasons why a kid might not eat. I'll just give you a few examples just to give you a feel for it. Sometimes they won't eat because they're not hungry because they got a huge snack at daycare right before they came home, and it was kind of like dinner for them, so they're not hungry. Another reason might be that they're in the middle of playing. They don't feel hungry. They're not noticing they're in the middle of something. And we know what that's like if you're in the middle of an email or something and you want to finish it and somebody tries to interrupt you like, come on, it's hot. And like, no, I got to finish, right? We have that inclination ourselves. So do kids. Play is their work, as they say. So that's another reason why kids might not want to eat. Another might be that they don't like the food. They don't, and that we can even break that down into they don't like the taste, they don't like the texture, they want a choice, there's too much on their plate. There's so many reasons why a kid might not eat. So I don't have one answer to how do we get a kid to eat, because I need to know why they don't want to eat first. So that's what, if that's your issue, I would ask you, what do you think's going on? Why do you think your daughter's not wanting to eat?
That's great. I'm going to break this down into some behavioral science where we usually think about what are the barriers to doing a behavior. And it sounds like that's a little bit of your language. Like, okay, we want the kid to eat, let's say, some veggies. And instead of just telling them you should eat your veggies, we want to think about what are the barriers preventing them from wanting to eat these veggies. And you go down kind of a list of options, and we could say things like, she just doesn't she tried the broccoli before and she doesn't like it, and so she's sitting down and refusing to eat the broccoli, but of course she'll want some of the nice dessert or whatever that comes after that. So how would you deal with that if you say, look, they've tried something before, they don't like it, and you kind of still want them to eat their veggies?
Okay, before remind me that question, but before I answer that question, I just want to comment on something you said. You said, we're looking at what are the barriers to the behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And that presumes that the behavior is something we should want.
Mm.
And that's something I also ask. Do we want her to eat if she's not hungry? Do we want her to eat something that she doesn't feel that feels good to her? So I encourage parents or people to question that goal first. Is that an appropriate goal? And I would say sometimes it's not. Sometimes we actually, if our goal is for kids to learn to listen to their bodies, to eat when they're hungry, to not eat when they're full or not hungry, then we need to ask ourselves, what is our ultimate goal? Is this going to achieve that? And oftentimes, especially around food, I do find that there's a lot of anxiety around feeding kids right, getting them to eat healthy. And we have this idea that broccoli is important. Well, some people don't like broccoli. And are we telling them that you should eat things that don't taste good to you? Or if or are we going to look at how kids adjust? If it's just a matter of taste, then we have to look at how do kids develop a taste for food. And I'm not the expert on how that develops, but I know that for a lot of kids, exposure is what gives them the familiarity to be willing to try and eventually to get used to and like food. A lot of times, if we think that it's a matter of taste, I'm going to look at those steps that you can do with kids. You can have them help pick it out at the grocery store. You can help them play with it, help cut it up and put it in the steamer or however you prepare it. You can offer them, do they want to smell it? What do you think it will smell like? Does it smell a lot like the carrot? Is it different? You can expose them in very many ways well before you get to that step of putting it in your mouth, chewing it, and swallowing it.
So to kind of bring us back, we're assessing, is this the right behavior to change? And assuming that it is, then we're still going through this analysis that says, look, if we think that it's one of these barriers like taste, then we look at, well, what's the theory of change to get someone to like a thing? Like, how would you get anyone to like a thing? This could be an
Right.
adult or a child. And you're going back to kind of the basics to say, well, there's exposure, there's familiarity, there's play to get them involved in it. So that's very nice. Now I'm gonna kind of flip it and say, what if they want something like a cookie and they've already had multiple cookies. And in this case, they're telling you what the behavior is. They're telling you, like, I want, my third cookie. And we could argue maybe that a third cookie is okay some days, but probably most days you would say that third cookie is not in the cards.
Yeah.
How would you handle that situation where the behavior may be a little bit more clear?
I would say a third cookie is not on the menu. If you're still hungry, I'll get you something else. Are you in the mood for something sweet? I could get you a banana. I could get you a slice of apple. And they'd say, no, I want a cookie. I know, cookies are so good. I bet you can't wait till the next time they're on the menu again. Hmm. What could, let's think of what you could eat that appeals to that sense of I just want something more.
So I'm going to call out a few things you just did there, and then you can correct me to say if is this correct. So one tactic is basically saying there's a menu, and this is just not on the menu. So you're setting some sort of like boundary, and then you're giving them options of what else they could do. So something saying, do you want this or that? And then you're also acknowledging the fact that they want the cookie, that there is a
Right.
feeling there, that there's some level of sadness because they didn't get the cookie. Is that correct, or how would you modify that summary?
I'll just elaborate that when I'm offering choices, I'm thinking about what is it about this desire for a cookie, that what's going on for this child? Why do they want a cookie? And I'm going to guess it's because it's sweet. It tastes good. We're designed as human beings to like sweet, but we're not designed to have as much sweet as we want. And when it comes to cookies, right? So I'm looking for a way to offer choices that both appeal to that desire. So it's not, I'm not saying you can't have a cookie, but if you like some broccoli, we have that. That's just unlikely to be a real choice. And when I talk with parents, I always say you want to offer choices that are real choices. It's not, you could get a cookie or you can eat spinach. For most kids, that's not an appealing alternative. So I'm looking for alternatives that would appeal to that desire within the bounds of what I am comfortable with. And for older kids, I'm thinking you have a 2-year-old, so I'm not going into the details about why we have two cookies and not 3, and serving sizes and amounts of sugar and all of that. As they get older, I would probably be sharing some of that information so that they understand how I make that decision of what's on the menu. But for a very young child, it's probably not going to be very convincing. They're not going to say, "Oh, thank you for explaining that, Mom. I'm totally fine with that now."
Okay, we're gonna do one more of these scenarios, and then we'll move into kind of summarizing some of the main theories. So, a child is upset about having to go to bed. What do you do?
So this is just a theoretical question, right? It's not that you've ever had this issue.
My child is so good at sleep; it's embarrassing, and so she asks for nighttime. She says night night.
Wow.
Yeah, so but I'm nervous about it changing. So let's pretend that it does change sometime and she will put up a fight.
So again, that first question that I say I ask, I would ask about this too. Why does this child not want to go to sleep? And there are many reasons why a kid doesn't want to go to sleep. The obvious ones, I'm having fun, I like to play, I don't want to go to sleep. But sometimes, even you might find this with your child, if she gets overtired, it gets harder to go to sleep. And in fact, that happens to us as adults. If you've ever been up super late and gotten sort of giggly and like you lie down and your mind is racing or whatever, and it's really hard to go to sleep. And there's medical, we can explain physiologically what's going on for somebody, but for purposes of our conversation, we can just acknowledge that an overtired child often has a hard time relaxing and going to sleep. So I often start by asking, how much sleep did this child get the 24 hours before? Was the nap too late, or was there no nap and the child's overtired? So again, I always want to understand what's going on for that child first before I can come up with a plan for what's going to be helpful for any particular child.
Okay, so it still comes down to kind of assessing and then maybe changing. In behavioral science, we say change the environment of decision making. So you're basically changing something about the child's environment so that it makes it more likely the next time that they would want to go to bed or be more up for it in the moment versus maybe convincing them in the moment of struggle, why they should be doing something, that you're changing kind of the setup.
Yes. But when you talk about the setup, I think it works very well for a lot of kids to have a routine. So they understand we go upstairs, we change into pajamas, we brush our teeth, we read stories, we lie down, maybe I rub your back. There's a certain routine and they know what to expect. For a lot of kids, that's very helpful to get them in the mood to sleep, to get them ready to relax, to let go. I think of that as the environment. The questions about what was going on in the rest of their day often has, well, I think of that differently. I think of that as what I have control out of the moment that might impact, any particular bedtime or evening routine.
Great. Okay.
And then you've got the whole psychological aspects of kids who don't want to separate, and sometimes kids want to know that we're there. So for example, my youngest used to do the typical game that maybe your 2-year-old doesn't do this, but a lot of 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds do. The mom, I need a glass of water. Mom, I have a question. You put them to bed and they pop out and there's some reason. And I figured out with her that she didn't want to separate from me. She wanted me to come back. It really wasn't about the questions. It wasn't about the glass of water or whatever it was. And the way I discovered this with her was I was putting her to bed and got her relaxed and rubbed her back, which I often did at night. And I couldn't finish my routine because I really had to go to the bathroom. So I said, Shiriel, I'll be right back. I'm just going to the bathroom, which was just across the hall. So it was not far. I'm just going to go pee and I'll be right back. And she stayed calm in her bed. And I went to the bathroom and I came back and I thought, uh-huh. So I rubbed her back some more. And then I said, I forgot to put water in the pot so I could soak. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to clean. I'll be right back. And I went downstairs and put water in the pot and came back. This became a thing that I did with her to separate from her so she would know I was coming back. And when I did this, when I started doing this, I noticed that she didn't have to try to pull me back. So she was able to stay relaxed and she was able to drift off to sleep. By the way, I put this story in one of our books, and Shiriel read it as an adult. And one of the things I did at one point, I honestly did this, was I said, I have to go and read an article in the newspaper and then I'll be right back. And she read it as an adult. She says, Mom, I fell for this? Like, yes, you did.
That's
But
great.
it was a way for her to know I was coming back so she didn't have to try.
Yeah. And what that reminds me of from a behavior change perspective in general is sometimes we have these ideas of what something is. We could say like working out or trying a new nutrition routine. And actually we just need to get comfortable with the starting it. So basically like if you're going to go for a really long bike ride, that's really scary and that doesn't probably feel like maybe something you would normally do. And so kind of like obviously you wouldn't start with a really long bike ride. You'd start buying a bike riding with friends, just trying it to get comfortable with something. And maybe for kids, the first thing they have to get comfortable with is, sleeping alone and having their mom leave them. And so having
And then
some
come back.
level of practice,
Yeah.
I'm going to leave, I'm going to come back, I'm going to leave, I'm going to come back, maybe makes
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. So you're kind of we call it in behavioral science a foot in the door, where we're trying to start something little by little.
I did that with homework with one of my
Mm-hmm.
kids. He would resist starting. And I think it was because it felt like this overwhelming task. If I start, it will never end. It will go on forever. I don't want to be doing that. When I started saying, just set the timer for 10 minutes and just do 10 minutes, that's enough. He would do 10 minutes and then it was like, well, as long as I'm here, I'll do another one. Wait, I'm almost done. And he would keep going. But there was something about starting that was so hard. And when we took the pressure off and it felt like you can just do it for a few minutes, just do the first problem, or, I break it down into something small, just like you say. Yep. It would get him started.
Okay, we're going to switch tactics like we are a little bit more to adults. And so what is the most persuasive idea or tactic that maybe is mentioned in the books that adults could kind of grab and go with or use in their day-to-day?
If you have a conflict with someone and you want them to do something differently, or you want them to understand why you are saying what you're saying or why you want something from them, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. The first thing I think of is what I always say to parents also, is to see things from their perspective first. and to acknowledge what's going on for them. We call it acknowledging feelings. So, can you give me an example of something that maybe an adult conflict?
Kind of a classic work one is we're just seeing an approach to kind of, let's say, a marketing or sales opportunity differently. One person wants to um, go more direct sales, and another person wants to have more of a relationship building sales approach. And so there's tension in the approach to how somebody would want to design a sales strategy or a marketing strategy.
Okay. So if I want to go the marketing route and you're the direct sales route, let's just say,
Right. Yeah.
and to the extent that I understand what those terms mean, I would want to acknowledge first what's going on, your perspective. It sounds like your thoughts are the direct sales approach is going to be better because we're going to have immediate contact, we'll have immediate sales, that will show up in our revenue, that will look better for our investors. Now, of course, I'm making this up, you would have to give me the details, but I would be sort of rephrasing what I heard from you, that it sounds as though that sounds like a better approach than what I was talking about, which sounds like it would be much more incremental and may not ever get us to where we want to go. Am I hearing it right?
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good summary of my thinking.
So that's where I would start. What often happens is when people are at cross purposes, they are trying to convince the other person that they're right. No, if we do it your way, then we're going to miss out on all these other opportunities. And if it doesn't work, we're going to be stuck and we're going to really be behind. And then the whole thing's going to blow up. And I don't know, I'm making this up, but I'm trying to convince you of my perspective. And you're sitting there thinking, no, you didn't even understand what I was saying. I wasn't really saying we had to do, it's not going to blow up because we already have these people who we could direct sales to. You have all these thoughts in your head. You're not really thinking along like what's true about what I'm saying. You're thinking about what's not true about what I'm saying. And I'm doing the same thing to you. So we're kind of, missing each other as we're talking to each other. So conflict 101, well, I mean, we could go back and, before even that, when I talk to parents, I say, when you're going to talk about a conflict, when you're going to try to solve a problem, the first step is to find a good time to talk. It's often not in the moment. It's not in the moment of conflict. That's when all of us are upset and feeling like, you don't get it. And we all feel like screaming. So oftentimes that's not the time to try to work it out. The best time is to say, I need to go to the bathroom. I need to get a glass of water. Maybe we can meet tomorrow, that sort of thing, so that we can all have a little time to calm down and talk to each other about the problem and look at it from each other's point of view. So we call it problem solving in our book. When you do it with kids, you look for a good time to talk first. Then, if it's a parent and a child, I always tell the parent, you start off by accepting the child's feelings and don't rush it. That is the most important step. And it's the step that most people forget or they rush through.
And that idea basically is like, as an adult, you just want to be heard as well. And so it makes sense that your child also wants to be heard or seen a little bit. And so if you miss this step, they, like an adult would get very defensive. A child may get cry or something, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yes.
the tactic here is just to acknowledge feelings or emotions. But do you have to agree with them? Because that is, I think, where maybe some of the parents may not want to agree with their child's anger. Where does that line come?
That's the second step. The first step, well, I'm sorry, I'm going to confuse you with the numbers. If once you found a good time to talk, then the first step is to acknowledge your child's feelings, see things from their perspective. Don't rush it. That's an important step. The second step is to describe the problem. That's where you get to talk about your own feelings, your own perspectives. What is the problem?
Yep. So this is a really nice insight for a few things. One is just when you're managing an employee or you're managing anyone and you want to give them directions. You want to say, hey, please do this. This proposal is saying actually a more effective way is, could you tell me how to do this in order to solve our joint problem? And then they come back with you with a long list of things that you can then have a thoughtful discussion about which one actually works to drive the outcomes you want, which is a very different approach to management than maybe is easier. It's easier to say, please run this campaign or please do this. We are coming with a problem to them and they're solving it. So that's very nice.
I was just going to comment on that,
Yeah.
which is that for at least for parents, and I imagine for managers too, it seems like the most efficient way to do it is to tell them exactly what I need them to do and expect them to listen, quote unquote, listen, which is clearly a euphemism for behave, right? Do what I say. But the problem is when we tell kids directly what we want them to do, we're creating resistance, which means they don't feel like doing what we want them to do. So we're actually making our job harder. If we can tap into that strong desire that people have, kids have, adults have, to be autonomous, to feel like I am the master of my life, I have free will, I decide what I do. If we can tap into that drive, then we're working as a team with our kids. We can say, ooh, we need to go. What do you need on your feet? I hear the shoes talking. I'm feeling so empty. If we could tap into their desire to play, their desire to be autonomous, then it makes our job much easier. And you're right. That's part of what I'm doing when I problem solve with them and say, you want to go to the park? I want to know how we're going to leave. We need to come up with an idea. Instead of telling them, I'm bringing them onto the team and say, what could we figure out that would work for everybody?
That's great. There's something in behavioral science called IKEA effect, which is basically the idea that if you build something or contribute to it, you may like it more. So the joke is that IKEA furniture may look worse, but because we built it, we like it more. Maybe there's something here around ideas where if you come up with the idea, it's your idea. We like our own ideas more than other people's, and we're willing to move forward with something if we contributed to it. Is that fair?
Absolutely. If you think about what you do on a daily basis, I'm just going to guess you get up in the morning, maybe you get a cup of coffee, maybe you put the plates out for breakfast and you put some toast in the toaster. If somebody was following you around saying, Kristen, okay, go put the coffee machine on. And did you get the plates? Not those, the other ones. Put them on the table. And now it's time for the toast. And you'd be like, I know what I'm doing. Don't tell me, right? It would be really annoying.
Yep.
That's the same principle.
Okay, let's move to praise. When we think about how do we give praise to kids, what are some of your guidance to parents of how to praise their children or not praise their children?
So when I do a workshop for parents, and one of the topics is praise, and I ask them to imagine a scenario. So let's give one for your audience. So you're working on a project and it's taken you several weeks to put the whole thing together, a lot of moving parts. You had to get, kinds of information and figure out how to put it all together. And you're really pleased with it when you finish, and you give it to your manager and your manager says, great job, thanks. How do you feel?
Like maybe they didn't read it.
Did they read it? Did they like it? I don't really know. Did they appreciate how much work I put into it? Did they notice that on page 10, really great idea, right? We want more feedback. We don't want great job, thanks, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we give that kind of feedback to kids a lot. So I suggest to parents a very different way of praising kids, which is not just for kids. What people want is they want descriptions that show appreciation. So for example, wow, there was so much thought put into this. I notice that you got that data from the marketing department and you took the perspective of the sales team and you figured out a way to, I'm completely making this up, but the more details the more we can describe what we see or describe the effect this is going to have on our ultimate goals, the more you're going to feel like you really do appreciate what I did. You noticed all the details. I was doing this workshop many years ago, and I had a dad in the group who also was a manager at a very large, very well-known company. I guess I shouldn't say the name, but you've all heard of it. And he had a lot of 20-somethings who were working for him. And he said the week after we talked about praise, he started using it with his reports with the 20-somethings who worked for him, as well as with his kids. And he said, They loved it so much. They said it was starting to become a problem because they kept coming to him, showing him, so excited to show what they had made so that he would tell them in detail what he noticed about what they'd made. So it's definitely not something just for kids. And there's a lot of science behind it, which you probably are aware of, but it applies to all ages.
And so maybe we take that on the flip too. If you want to give them feedback on something, so they basically turn something in, maybe you do appreciate all these small details about the effort they put in. How would you frame then the thing that you don't like about it? Like what would be the words to give kind of the criticism to the person? Or maybe we're just going back to problem solving together, but is that the
Well,
case?
you might want to be saying, I really appreciate the report you made. You have a lot of detail, and I think you've really solved that one question that we were asking about in that meeting the other day. I think that what's next, or what's missing, is, I don't know what it is, the X.
Mhm.
And so, we can definitely give that kind of feedback. Like, here's what I think is next for you, or here's what's missing, or here's what, like I like to think in terms of kids. So I'll give you the kid example. You ask your kid to clean up their room because company's coming, and they have, chaos in their room. There's Lego, there's laundry, there's books all over the place, there's dirty tissues, right? And, you're like, this is a nightmare. So you say, honey, the room needs to be cleaned up because people are coming. And your kid starts working at it, and you go off to, clean up the living room or whatever, and you come back and you see them sitting there on the floor playing with the Lego, right? So probably you're not pleased with that because you're hoping that they're going to make progress. But what they appreciate is to be kids want to be appreciated for what they did first before we criticize them for, or point out what needs to be next. So it would be something like this. Ooh, you got all the dirty socks and the dirty underwear and this dirty t-shirts put in the laundry, and the dirty tissues are in the garbage. And I noticed you've got the books lined up nicely on the shelf. Now what's not left to do is some Lego. So I'm appreciating what's done before I head into instead of the where our brains go is, there's so many Legos still. This does not look cleaned up, right?
Yep.
That's where our brains go, to the problems.
And there's a behavioral science principle called goal gradient, which is basically the idea that once you get closer to a goal, you're more likely to finish it. So that's kind of why marathon runners hit 4 hours. Is it's not because humans are built for 4 hours, or if you're in half marathon 2 hours. It's that once you get closer to the goal, you'll run faster because you're seeing the goal. And so the idea of showing people progress and that you're almost there kind of
Yeah.
makes sense in this idea that people would run faster because they're almost complete with the goal and you're highlighting the progress. In fact, in some of the studies, they articulate you'd never want to highlight 80% left to go. You'd only highlight, you would say 20% done, but you would never say you have all this stuff to go because then people would be
Right.
so demotivated.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you're always trying to get to make it seem like they're closer to finish.
Yeah. 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 That makes sense.
So maybe we'll move to a broader topic around, and it's a hot topic in parenting. It would be the word gentle parenting. This is generally like in parenting, there's lots of philosophies and buzzwords that come up around how to deal with or not deal with your child. And so would love your two things. One is any thoughts on the word gentle parenting and what this means, and then any other critiques of these kind of models of parenting that have these words to describe different ways to parent.
I don't know where this term comes from. I have seen it written. I think
Mhm.
some people have referred to my work as gentle parenting. I never used that term. I don't know exactly what it's supposed to mean. It's true that I don't advocate hitting kids. And so if that's the comparison, and I suppose this is a more gentle approach, but this is not a permissive approach. This is not an approach where we don't have limits. And we haven't really talked about, well, maybe we have a little bit, with the cookie, but we talk about taking action without insult, but taking action when kids are going beyond the boundaries of whatever the activity is that gentle. I would argue that the language we use when we're imposing limits are important. It's not let's take an example. The kid is at the playground and keeps throwing the sand at the other kids, right? And I've said the sand isn't for throwing, and we can put the sand in the bucket, or we could pour sand. Or you're in the throwing mood, let's go see if we can find something to throw. Maybe we could throw some leaves, maybe we can throw something else that's around at the playground, right? I've done all of that, and this kid keeps going back to the playground and scooping up sand and throwing it at the other kids. So I'm not going to keep trying. I'm going to, at that point, say to myself, this child can't resist the urge to throw sand, and this is not safe, and so I need to take charge. And so I say, I'm taking you home. And for a little kid, it might mean that I'm taking his hand or I'm picking him up. I'm taking you home. I see it's too tempting to throw the sand. I'm too worried about it getting in other kids' eyes. In fact, this is too many words for a 2-year-old, but you get the idea, right? Some of these messages, and he would be crying and screaming, and no, 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 I want to stay. And I'd say, we can come back another time and try. For today, I need to know that sand won't get in kids' eyes. So I don't know. Is that gentle? I suppose it's gentler than smacking a kid. It's gentler than saying, you're such a bad kid, I told you not to throw the sand and you did it anyway, and now it's your own fault that you're leaving, and you're losing the privilege of playing at the playground. In fact, we're not coming back until this weekend at the earliest. It's not that. I'm not trying to shame a kid. I'm not trying to make him feel bad. I'm showing him that I am in charge, and I see that you can't control yourself, so I'm going to do it.
You did two things there. One is, in the first strategies, you're not telling a kid what not to do as much as you're telling them what they can do. And I think that we haven't talked about this yet, but this is the idea, maybe is a little gentler, but maybe not in the, quote unquote word gentle parenting, where you're directing effort and energy to say, like, do this. You're saying the sand cannot be thrown, but you also have 3 other options of what to do. Can you talk a little bit about why directing energy towards what to do is better than what directing energy towards what not to do?
Oh, that's so much easier when somebody tells you what you can do. If we're talking about a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, if we say, don't throw the sand, well, what am I supposed to do? Because I feel like throwing it, right? A 2-year-old doesn't know how to not do something. I remember I think I was about 5, because I had learned how to read a few words, and I knew the word walk and I knew the word don't. And we were somewhere where there was a walk sign, and the walk sign switched to don't walk. And I had been told, you never run in the street. And when I came up to that sign and it said don't walk, I thought, that's wrong, because the only other alternative is to run. And I thought, I know I'm not supposed to run in the street. And it was very confusing to me why the adults put a sign that said don't walk. I thought, yes, you are supposed to walk, right? Because even at that age, and I was older than 2 or 3 because I was reading, I didn't know what it meant to not walk. And I've always wondered, why don't they use the word wait? Like, tell me what to do. That's a lot easier than making me figure out what not walking is. So there you go.
This is great. I think, we even look at parking signs in our cities. They say don't park here, but they don't give us the directions of where to park. So there could be some real urban planning changes from this idea. And then the final, the second comment on this, like taking the child out of the situation, is basically, we are influenced by our environment. And so if the child isn't able to resist temptation, and in behavioral science, we call it present bias, where there's something really, really tempting about the situation, you would just remove yourself from the situation. You're not going to like sit with a bowl of candy when you're on a diet right next to you. You'd remove the bowl of candy, or you'd remove yourself. And so the idea of removing a child from a very tempting situation kind of makes sense in this, that you're designing their environment so they can succeed at some level.
You may be removing the child, or you may be removing the thing. I remember when my kids were young, at some point we got a little container of face paint crayons. They thought those were very cool, and they wanted to use them all the time on everything, themselves included. And I realized this was not an activity that I wanted to endorse at any time in any place. And I hid them away. And the reason I'm thinking of this now is because I put them up with the higher up plates in our cabinet in the kitchen. And I found them the other day. I was like, oh, this is where the face paints went. Yeah. So if you put them out of sight and out of mind, then you don't have to be trying to control it in some other way. So yes, that's I guess you would call that managing the environment instead of the child.
And if you were to think about conflict, which is probably one of the drivers, so backing up, you're basically saying like one thing to solve for would be relationships. Like you want to have a good relationship with your child. The child likely wants to have a good relationship with you. We know plenty of adults that have bad relationships with their parents, and we all probably want to avoid this fate. And so conflict does seem to be one of the areas by which could really radically just decrease that relationship. So if you were to have one tip for parents, and I know you've written a full book, but if you were to have one tip for parents on managing conflict effectively, what would you what would you give them as parting advice?
Start by seeing it from their perspective first. I guess that's where that, if I have to if I have to start with one point, that's where I would say, not, it doesn't mean that you agree with them, but it means you really understand what it feels like to be them. You understand from their perspective what their experience is in this conflict, because that's the best way to figure out how to resolve conflict, is to understand what the conflict is. And some people talk about the needs under the feelings, the needs behind the conflict. And I think the way that we know we have needs is that we have certain feelings, right? I feel resentful that people keep telling me what to do, or I feel tired and I don't feel like I want to do it. Like, if we can understand what those feelings are, then that's the first step in figuring out how to resolve the conflict. It's not the full picture. You have to read the whole book to get the whole picture, but yes, that's the first step.
Of course. Wonderful. Thank you for listening. If you like the show, go to irrationallabs.com to say hello to us or post a review on Apple or Spotify. Big thank you to the show's two Jacks, Jack Buer, our writer, and Jack Steger, our genius editor. Until next time.